So right now I am going live. We got something in the chat. And PEO. Well, that's just everybody, because now I've heard Robbie, PEO, and Reeves. I've heard that one thing that can affect it is making a hotspot out of your phone. Try not to do that if you can possibly avoid it. When I used to go to the gym in Hank House, sometimes the Wi-Fi would be slowed down. Trinidad agrees. If that's the case, try not to make it a hotspot, because it does tend to slow down for everybody. I don't really know much more about how it works, but there you go. And that's how I spent 4 minutes talking about Wi-Fi. So now let's kind of move on and talk about thinking, language, and intelligence. If you are grabbing the notes on e-learning, I did just pull them up, so you should be able to access them there as well. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what it means to have intelligent behavior and talk about thinking and language. So let's talk about thinking. So when we talk about thoughtful behavior, we are talking about cognition. And so cognitive psychology, we've already kind of touched on this when we talked about memory. Cognition is all about mental activity. So this includes the mental activities that are involved with what we would call thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. And so in particular, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some different mental activities that are involved in thinking behavior. That includes things like problem solving, that includes things like decision making, and that includes things like judgment formation. So when we talk about problem solving, if you have a flat tire and you don't necessarily have a phone nearby, how are you going to try to fix it? When we talk about decision making, we're talking about even things that you feel like you don't put a lot of thought into, what you have for breakfast, what you're deciding to wear, whether or not you're choosing to come into class on your designated day or being on Zoom. And then judgment formation, we make judgments all the time. So when I judge that because the weather's kind of iffy looking that I should pack a coat, which I do, that would be a case of a judgment. For the purposes of this lecture, we're largely going to talk about the kind of judgments involved in judging the likelihood of something. So how likely is this event to happen? Or how representative is this person to a particular class of people? So is this person like my stereotype of what an engineer is, for example? So we're going to talk about each of these in turn. Does anybody need some more time here or have any questions? Okay. So we're going to start by talking about problem solving. So problem solving often comes into play when we kind of have to recognize that there is a goal state that we want to achieve. But we don't always necessarily know the best way to achieve that goal state. So for example, if I'm trying to solve a maze, so if I am at a restaurant and they give me a placemat with a maze on it, I don't know that there are places that still do that, but for the sake of the argument, let's say I asked for the kids menu and they gave me a placemat with a maze on it. So I know a few things. I know where my starting point is in the maze. I know where my end goal is. And I have a bunch of different routes that I can use to basically try to find my way to that goal. But there are a lot of different ways that I could try to get to the end of the maze. One of those first ways is what is known as trial and error. And trial and error basically sounds like what you think it is. So with trial and error, if I'm trying to work my way through the maze, I am going to try any route and I'm going to take it to the end until I either hit the goal or I hit a dead end and I have to start over. So I will try any potential solution and I will keep learning from my mistakes. Trial and error does not necessarily get you to the goal any faster, because you could try the same route over and over and over again. So it's kind of like a spaghetti solution. You're kind of throwing stuff at the wall with no rhyme or reason for why you're throwing it that way, and you're basically trying to see what sticks. But the next thing that we can do is something called an algorithm. So we can work out all possible solutions systematically. So is anybody interested in things like computers and computer science? So an algorithm is how a computer will typically try to solve problems. It will work out all possible solutions and carry them, it will work out all possible solutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about an algorithm and what it is in the next slide. We're also going to talk about heuristics. When you hear the word heuristics, I want you to think about wiggling your thumbs. And that's because a heuristic is basically a rule of thumb that you have learned based on experience that can very quickly help you solve a problem. So heuristics are very, very quick at solving problems when they work, but they're also prone to errors. And we'll talk about those as well. And then the final way that we can solve a problem is with something called insight. Insight is a sudden realization to a problem. It's almost like, y'all seen Despicable Me? Yeah, you have. You know when Gru gets those light bulb moments? So that's kind of what insight is. It's like a light bulb goes off in your head and you get this experience of, oh, that's the solution. So we'll talk about each of these a little bit more. Now, trial and error can work, but it can take a long time. Yes?
So back to the example with the maze. Say you start from the end point instead of the beginning. What would that fall under?
If you're working from the end point and working your way back, that would be probably a heuristic, I would say. That, or possibly an algorithm. So, but it's definitely not trial and error, because that's a very strategic sort of way. You know the end goal and you work your way back. I think that would probably be more of a heuristic than an algorithm. So an algorithm is basically solving problems the way that a computer would. Who here likes anagrams? I actually really do. So let's say I gave you this type of anagram right here, and maybe some of you have already figured it out. If you've read ahead in your textbook, you already know what the answer is, and come on, y'all, it's a psychology class. So you probably have a pretty good idea now of what it might be. But if I were a computer, the only way that I can solve this anagram is by working through all possible iterations of this. So an algorithm will basically re-scramble all the letters. So in this case, they might choose to invert the P and the L and see if it makes a word. So they're going to look at all possible combinations of letters before getting the solution. Now, here's the thing. An algorithm will absolutely get you to the solution. It will. It's designed to. The problem is that if you exhaust all possibilities here, there are 907,200 different iterations that you're going to have to work through before you get the correct answer. So algorithms do work. They're effective, but they're incredibly time-consuming. And unlike a computer whose job is to basically compute, you don't have that kind of time. You have other things that are more important. So this is a case where heuristics can actually really help us out. So a heuristic is basically when we use our knowledge and our expectations to basically constrain some of these possibilities. So it's much more thoughtful. So a heuristic are simple thinking strategies. So for example, if you're dealing with a maze, starting at the goal and working your way back. So heuristics are these very simple thinking strategies. And again, if you're having trouble remembering what they are rules of thumb. Wiggle your thumbs. Heuristics are going to be a lot less time consuming, but they are prone to errors and mistakes. Algorithms will exhaust all possible solutions until the right one is achieved. You can't make an error with an algorithm unless the algorithm is bad. But heuristics will take less time, but because it's a very simple thinking strategy, it might occasionally lead to a mistake. So here's the great part about you being a human being that uses language. You know that certain letter combinations will not happen when you're solving an anagram. So for example, odds are pretty good if you have a working knowledge of the English language, there's not a word that starts with YY. So you can basically get rid of those. Another possibility is that we have a lot of words that end in Y. So maybe if we put Y at the end, we might actually get the word. So maybe we put Y at the end, we start getting a better idea of what it could be. We scramble, it's looking closer. Ta-da! The answer is psychology. And I kind of gave you a hint, so hopefully you figured it out. But does that kind of make sense, the difference between an algorithm and a heuristic? So an algorithm is going to try all possibilities. This is saying, I know language, I know what's probably more likely, and I know what's less likely, and I'm going to basically unscramble these in a way that's based on that knowledge. Here's another common heuristic. So let's say I asked you to list all of the words in the English language that start with Q. So one of the first things that we can do, we can go ahead and assume that 9 times out of 10, the second letter is going to be a U. Because Q is usually, not always, but usually followed by a U. So quick, queen, quip, quirk, etc. Additionally, we can also assume that the third letter is probably going to have to be a vowel. I very, very rarely see letters that start with Q, U, and then another consonant. It generally does not happen. And in our language, we don't actually like a lot of consonants in a row because qua is basically functioning as a consonant here. We don't like to have a lot of consonants without a vowel to immediately follow them. So now let's kind of talk about insight. So insight is basically the novel realization of a solution to a problem. So do you remember back in chapter 5 when we talked about the Gestalt psychologists? Well, they're back, and they're here to talk about problem solving. So a lot of work that was done on insight was done with different chimpanzees with the Gestalt psychologists. And so what they would do is they would basically put a chimpanzee in a situation where they had to try to retrieve a banana. But the way to get to that banana was not always clear. So perhaps there were a bunch of boxes in this space, and it would take the chimp several tries before they suddenly realized that the boxes could be stacked and they could reach the banana that way. Another instance that is kind of related to this, there would be an instance where they'd put a chimp in a situation where there would be a banana, and they also had 2 sticks. But each stick on its own was too short to actually reach the banana. However, if the chimp realized that those sticks could be connected, that could suddenly make a longer stick that could be used to retrieve that banana. And generally with insight, it's actually kind of interesting. I'm going to go ahead and stop share for a minute because I want to show you something on the board. So one of the things that we know when we look at insight versus other types of problems, one of the things that we can do is we can look at what is called a feeling of warmth. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on my x-axis. And yes, I am calling it FOW. There we go. And then on my, or that's on my y-axis. And then on my x-axis, I have time. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that researchers have actually looked at this feeling of warmth for standard problems like the math problems that you might get in like algebra or calculus class or things like that. And what we tend to find with those standard problems is that feeling of warmth kind of changes like this over time. So that's pretty nice. The longer, the more time that you spend on the problem, the closer and closer and closer you feel that you are getting to that solution. So if we're talking about word problems, logic problems, math problems, problems that don't involve insight, this is what it looks like. The closer you get to the solution, the greater sense of warmth you feel. Insight looks completely different. Here's what feeling of warmth looks like in an insight problem. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Oh my gosh, I know it. So insight, problems that utilize insight are going to be completely different. Feeling of warmth and feeling like you are getting closer to that solution is pretty low until you realize the solution, and then all of a sudden you have this massive increase in that feeling of warmth. And researchers have looked at these differences and determined that the way that we solve these problems is different based on the reported feeling of warmth. Kind of cool. So let's go back and share. Aha. So insight can actually be really useful. You don't need to write this down. I'm gonna tell you a joke. So oftentimes we will tend to find that the reason that we find the punchline of jokes so funny and getting the joke is because of something like insight. So I believe one of the previous iterations of your textbook listed this as the funniest joke in the world. I don't know. I actually think it's kind of dark, but if you're into dark humor, you will enjoy this joke. So let me go ahead and read this. A couple of New Jersey hunters are out in the woods when one of them falls to the ground. He doesn't seem to be breathing. His eyes are rolled back in his head. The other guy whips out his cell phone and calls emergency services. He gasps to the operator, "My friend is dead. What can I do?" The operator, in a calm, soothing voice, says, "Just take it easy. I can help. First, let's make sure he's dead." There's a silence. Then a shot's heard. The guy's voice comes back on the line. "Okay, now what?" That's dark. That is dark. But if you found that funny, it's because you had a sudden insight that when the guy was, the emergency services were basically saying, check to see if he's dead, this was very clearly misunderstood by the guy. So part of the reason that we enjoy jokes so much is because of the insight that is involved in getting the punchline. I tend to find a lot of my humor is based on references to things that I like or things that I know, like quotes or things like that. And there's very much this, to borrow Captain America from the Avengers, I understood that reference. We get the insight of the reference, and getting that reference can be more fun for us. Now, there are some problems with problem solving. One of the major obstacles that we often tend to find with problem solving, and really, I would say that this goes beyond problem solving. I think this is basically a problem anytime that we are trying to approach anything in our everyday life. We engage in a lot of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is our tendency to search for information that confirms what we already believe. So for example, this year I'm not touching political stuff with a 10-foot pole, but I will talk about masks. So there are people who believe that masks work, and there are people who believe that they don't. And I would probably imagine that people who believe that masks don't work spend a lot of time when they're trying to support their argument, only looking at the arguments that confirm what they already believe. Now, likewise, people who believe that masks do work will often try to send or share their resources that they use to show that masks work. The problem is that, again, we are engaging in confirmation bias. The information that I send to somebody who may not believe that masks work, I believe that it's true because I potentially cherry-picked it, and it may not necessarily be interpreted by that other person in the same way. The other way that we kind of see this is that we generally tend to watch news or listen to news that we agree with. So generally what we're going to find is people who tend to be more liberal, they watch channels like CNN, MSNBC. People who tend to be more conservative tend to watch Fox. And generally, I very rarely hear about somebody who has a liberal orientation watching Fox News, or somebody with a more conservative orientation reading something like Huffington Post or listening to something like NPR. We all have a tendency to pick things that confirm what we already believe. And if you're interested in trying to break out of a bubble and get a better sense of other people's perspectives, confirmation bias can actually really hurt our ability to consider other perspectives, because we're only looking at things that confirm what we believe to be true. Another problem that we have is what is called fixation. Now, this is something that is much more specific to problem solving. We have an inability to see a problem from a new perspective. In essence, we represent a problem in a certain way, and we get stuck thinking that that is the way that it has to be. Okay. So if you are on Zoom or if you are in class and you have a pen and paper handy, you do not have to turn this in. This is just for fun. We're going to do a problem. If you already know the answer, don't spoil. I'm serious. Don't spoil it. But we're going to do the matchstick problem. So you've got 6 matches. And what I'd like you to do is basically arrange 6 matches to form 4 equilateral triangles. Let's be clear on what equilateral means. All sides have to have the same length. So think about how you would potentially solve this problem. I'll give you a few minutes to try to draw it out. All right. Anybody have some thoughts? Okay, so I think I can do this without having to socially distance. I'm going to walk around and look at people in the class. And then those of you that are on Zoom, when I come back, if you'd like to share what you did on your camera, if you drew it out, we will do that too. But first, I'm going to see what the class came up with. Okay. So the problem with that one is that when you're trying to put the matchsticks in the middle, they would have to be a little bit longer because the hypotenuse would have to be a little longer. So that's I like how you're thinking with that, but that's not going to work if they're all the same size. They would have to, the ones in the center that are crisscrossing would have to be a little longer. Hold it up, let me see it. What you got? Anybody want to share? Let me see. No? Okay. Okay. All right. So what's pretty common here in for those that are doing it in class, they have a square and then they have two matchsticks in the middle. That's close, but it's not quite going to work. Anybody on Zoom want to share what they have? So anybody want to share what they have? It's okay if you don't. But I'll kind of pull this up on the chat, not the chat. I stopped share on the screen. So here's what a lot of people are getting, and on the chat, you can tell me if you got that too. So a lot of people are thinking that it's something like this. Now the problem is, for this to work, these would have to be a little bit longer. So here's something kind of important. I never said that these had to be flat. I never said that these had to be flat. So I never said that the matchsticks had to lay flat. So now that I've said that, does that change your answer to the problem? Yeah? Hmm? Okay, so now that you've had a little more time to think about it, and now that I've said that it doesn't have to lay flat, who came up with something like this? Okay, so if you had difficulty trying to solve this problem, it's because you occasionally get stuck in this idea that because the matchsticks are laying flat, that the solution to the problem must also be flat. But you'll notice I never said that they had to be flat. I only said they had to form 4 equilateral triangles. So you get stuck in this idea that they have to be in 2 dimensions. Turns out the only solution to this problem is if you make it 3-dimensional. So we've got an equilateral triangle on the bottom, and then we've got 3 on the sides. There's your 4 equilateral triangles. So an offshoot of fixation is what's referred to as functional fixedness. This is the tendency to see the uses of an object or the functions of an object as being fixed and unchanging. So if you still have your notes out, your little scribbles from the last problem, we're going to do another one. It's one of the few times I can do these because you don't need social distancing to do them. Okay. So here's the problem. This is the famous candle mounting problem by Dunker. So using these materials, how would you mount the candle on the bulletin board? And here's what's really critical. You have to mount it in such a way that wax will not drip on the floor. So go ahead and think about how you would draw out that solution. All right. Would anybody care to share their drawing of the solution? Let's see. Yup, that is exactly it. Oh gosh. Okay. So Pandora asked, you can nail the box to the board and put the candle in it, right? So that is the solution to the problem. How many of you got that solution? Now, I'll admit the first time that I ever did this problem in my cognitive psychology class, I was like, stick a thumbtack through the candle and put it on the wall. That doesn't work. The thumbtack is not going to be thick enough to actually hold the candle through that wall, and you have nothing to do with dripping the wax. If you fail to realize that that's the solution to the problem, some of that could be because you saw the box of matches and the matches inside it and believed that the box of matches could only be for holding matches. So good on those of you who got the solution to the problem. The idea here is that the box can be used to hold a lot of things. If we get stuck in functional fixedness, this is because we believe that the box is for matches and thus can only hold matches. So good job if you were able to creatively realize that a box of matches can hold a lot of other things besides matches. Okay. So that's it for problem solving. If you'd like to learn more about problem solving, I do teach a class in cognitive psychology every fall, and I always welcome you to take it. Now we're going to move on to talking about making decisions and forming judgments. So every day we are actually making hundreds of different judgments and decisions. And generally, we don't really think very much about the judgments that we make. So the choices that you make and the decisions that you make and the judgments that you make are typically ones that you don't really think that much about. So for example, it's gray today. Should I wear a coat? Should I wear a hat? Should I bring an umbrella? Do I want to come to class? What do I want to have for breakfast? Do I want to have breakfast? What type of coffee do I want? If there are multiple types of coffee. Generally speaking, you don't think that much about it. And as I kind of mentioned last week, generally the fate of the world does not hinge on what you have for breakfast. These choices seem inconsequential. And in fact, they are. Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, when you get back in, I'll still be here. Apparently a fire alarm went off. Oh gosh. I heard, did y'all have a fire drill pretty recently? I heard about that. I heard that, do you have them in the morning still? Yeah, that's good. I can always tell when the fire alarm goes off because everybody shows up to my class looking exhausted. I'm like, did you have a fire alarm? They're like, yeah.
I had to evacuate like the week before that too.
Oh, I'm sorry. So generally, we don't have a lot of time to really think about it. So yeah, if you're in Reeves, you should already not be listening to me, but I'll still be here when you come back, I hope. If not, it is filmed on YouTube, so you'll be able to catch this later. So we make hundreds of choices every day, and researchers like Kathleen Vohs, so that's V-O-H-S if you're interested in learning more, actually talks about what is called choice fatigue or decision fatigue. These choices really don't feel like much, but the multiple choices that you make every day add up over time, and each of them costs you a little bit of energy. And so one of the things that we find is that if you can cut down on those choices occasionally, having the same thing for breakfast every day, wearing the same type of outfit every day, that actually cuts down on your choice fatigue. It's kind of interesting. But most of the time, we're not really thinking very deeply about these choices or these decisions. And oftentimes we will use heuristics for this. So we're going to talk about two different types of heuristics that we use that generally work pretty well for us, but they can actually lead us astray. So we're going to talk about the representativeness heuristic, and we're going to talk about the availability heuristic. Now, something that I may have mentioned, I don't know if I've mentioned it in a while, there is no Nobel Prize in psychology. The Nobel Prize was invented before psychology became a formal discipline. However, that doesn't mean that psychologists haven't won the Nobel Prize. They just usually tend to win it in fields like economics, which is based on choice behaviors. So you are looking at the images of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, both of whom are cognitive psychologists, and they have actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for their work on these heuristics. Daniel Kahneman has actually written a massive book on this. It's in my office, and it's literally like this thick, called Thinking Fast and Slow. We do have a copy in the library if you're interested in reading it. But we're going to talk about these heuristics now. Generally, they work pretty well. They tend to be based on our experiences, but we can also make mistakes with them as well. I need some Dr. G fuel. Does anybody need some more time here? Okay. So we're going to start by talking about the representativeness heuristic. So when we use the representativeness heuristic, we are judging the likelihood of things or objects in terms of how well they seem to fit a prototype. So we do this a lot more often than we think we do. So for example, for those of you that watch the taped review session later, at the very end, you get to see a little bit of my cat. My cat is probably one of the least cat-like cats that I've ever seen. So I have a prototype of the cat that a cat doesn't really care whether you're around or not. A cat's not really very affectionate generally most of the time. A cat's not super cuddly. They're very independent. They're aloof. They're standoffish. That is not my cat. My cat is like a dog in cat form. My cat waits by the door for me to come home, or at least he did before the dog showed up. My cat loves to curl up with me at every opportunity. My cat follows me around everywhere. My cat is very affectionate and sweet and very uncat-like. I have a prototype of what a cat should be, and my cat doesn't act like that. Odds are pretty good you can think about instances where you have a prototype of how something should be or what something is like, and you discover somebody doesn't necessarily fit that. So here's a story about a man named Steve. You don't need to write this down. So Steve is meek and tidy. He has a passion for detail. He's helpful to people, but he has little real interest in people or in real world issues. Is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a salesperson? So if you are not in Reeves and you are still, if you are still on Zoom right now and you're not in Reeves, tell me what you think Steve is more likely to be in the chat. Salesperson or librarian? Okay, we got one person saying librarian. Okay, or in the Discord if you prefer. Okay, so we've got one person who said librarian. I guess a lot of people were, oh, we got another librarian. Okay, he would definitely want to be a librarian. Well, that's a little bit different from actually being a librarian, Chloe. If you had to make a decision on what he's most likely going to be, not what he wants to be, would you pick a librarian or a salesperson? Like, you got to make a clear choice, one or the other. I know that's not how life works, but it's how it works right now. Okay, librarian. Now, let me ask y'all in the class. Who says salesperson? Who says librarian? Who says, you don't know that person, Dr. Gilchrist, why don't you ask him instead of judging him? Technically, that's the correct answer, but most people are going to say librarian because it fits with our idea that that's what a librarian is like. You have an idea of what a librarian is like in your head. D is arguing for a salesperson, and I would actually argue that he's probably most likely to be a salesperson, and here's why. Who do we have more of in the world, salespeople or librarians? We have salespeople. And so because of that, just on the basis of sheer frequency alone, Steve's more likely to be a salesperson simply because there are more salespeople. But most of us are going to believe that Steve's a librarian because we have this idea of what a librarian is. We believe that librarians are introverted, they're detail-oriented, they like books, they like these categorization systems like the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress system, and they're probably not that interested in people. Now, on the other hand, you have a stereotype of a salesperson as well. These people have to be people persons. They have to be very outgoing. They have to be very gregarious and talkative and things like that. And Steve doesn't really fit that profile. So you have a prototype in your mind of what a librarian is. Steve looks like he fits that profile. And so we're going to say he's more likely to be a librarian. So the representativeness heuristic can be good, but as you can kind of see, it can lead to errors and stereotyping. And we'll talk more about stereotyping in particular when we talk about social psychology. Your mind wants to simplify the world around it at all times. And because of that, you make categories. The problem is that when we work from those categories, we don't necessarily see people as individuals. And then additionally, most people don't use what is called a base rate of occurrence. So this is where Dr. G drops some statistics on you. One of the things that we have to keep in mind if we want to judge likelihood, we have to know the base rate of occurrence. We have to know how many salespeople there are in the world. We have to know how many librarians there are in the world. Generally, there are more salespeople than librarians. So in terms of math, Steve's more likely to be a salesperson. You don't have to be an extrovert to be a salesperson. Some of you have worked in customer service and you are not the most extroverted people on earth. You know, I am a very extroverted person. If you open up the dictionary, my picture is probably under extrovert. I love people and people give me so much energy. But most professors are not extroverted. Most of them are introverted. So we have to kind of think about those base rates. Occasionally we'll be wrong, but we're also wrong with the representativeness heuristic occasionally as well. So the next one that we are going to talk about, and we'll probably end pretty close to here, that clock keeps getting slower and slower. It's already like 4 minutes behind. So the availability heuristic is estimating the likelihood that an event will occur based on how readily you can pull it up in memory. So here's an example. Is there anybody that does not like to fly? Is there anybody here that does not like flying? And that goes for y'all on Zoom too. If you do not like flying, please share.
I like getting to the destination.
Okay.
But sometimes the actual flight scares me.
Okay, why does the flight scare you?
I have no control over it.
When turbulence happens, what do you feel is going to happen?
Oh, I'm going straight down, straight.
So you're worried about crashing. Okay, so here's a question that I have for you and anybody else who's afraid of flying. Do you have these thoughts when you're driving a car or when you're a passenger in a car? Really? Okay, that's different. That's very different because most of the time, most people who are afraid of getting in a plane and flying have no problem getting in a car, despite the fact that the car is probably going to be far more deadly.
It's usually when other people are driving.
Yeah, I and as a fellow control freak, I get that. I absolutely get that. I love to drive because I'm the one in control of the car. Like, do you do the thing where if somebody else is driving and they're late to brake, you press the invisible brake with your foot? Anytime that I turn a hard corner, my partner grabs onto the handle and I'm like, I'll look over at him. I'm like, I'm not going to tip the car over. What are you doing? Everybody kind of has this. But a lot of people who are afraid to fly have no problem getting behind the wheel of a car. So here's part of the reason why it happens. It's not the only reason. Anytime that a plane crashes, it makes news because it's rare. So when I've got really bad luck with this, by the way. I went on the international trip twice. And both times that I went to the international trip, the day that I was going home, there was a major plane crash that happened. So when I was coming back from Barcelona in 2015, the Germanwings disaster happened. This past year, in 2019, when I was coming back from Barcelona, the Ethiopian Air Boeing the Boeing Max accident happened. And I'm like, oh gosh, but when that happens, it makes news. When a car crash happens, it's common. Unless it's really bad, it doesn't make the news. So when you're trying to think of the likelihood of things, those plane crashes pop in your head more and they're easier to draw up because they make news. And that leads you to believe that they're more frequent and they're more likely than they actually are. So we'll talk some more about this next time, especially in light of the fact that it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. I will also talk about how the representativeness heuristic applies to that. Everybody have a, Dr. Gilchrist, stop going to Barcelona. Never! I love Barcelona. Never, never, never. All right, y'all. So have a great day. If you were in Reeves and you're coming back from the fire drill, I did film this, so you ought to be pretty good. And you can watch the rest of it later. Everybody have a great day. I will see you on Wednesday. Good luck on your exam if you have not taken it, and I will see you